They say the desert keeps its secrets because the wind buries them. The Nazca Plateau cradles lines that refuse to be buried. From the air, the drawings are enormous, precise. Birds, spiders, long straight paths etched into the earth like the bones of a map. People have argued for centuries about why they were made. Theories crowd like birds at the edge of a field. Tonight, under a sky that remembers the universe, a different explanation slides into the possible. Not gods, not irrigation, not crop markers. A signal left like a breadcrumb by a visitor watching us from the outside. What the Nazca Lines were hiding was never about navigation. It was a warning. It was an instruction. It was an improbable key left by an intelligence that had learned the only sound that could wake certain kinds of silence. If you want the full story, the visions, the practical steps, the survival choices, subscribe now. Donald Rivera finished his shift at dawn because the world keeps asking him to finish what someone else began. He walked out of the emergency department with the stiffness of hands that had refused to relax for 12 hours. They argued every night at shift change. Human bodies in pieces, stories folded into paper, faces that needed immediate saving. He could memorize protocols faster than a child learns nursery rhymes. He could read the rhythm of a failing heart as easily as a composer reads a phrase on a page. He was good at that. He earned the efficiency others admired. He had been trained to be precise, to contain emotion with surgical gloves, to replace worry with actions. That training saved lives. It had also taught him something else by accident, how to be present without feeling present. Empathy atrophied like an unused muscle. He called it survival. He told himself it was the only way to keep doing the work without imploding. At the edge of those long nights, he felt less like a man and more like an engine that had learned to ignore the warning lights. Tonight had been the worst. A child with an airway obstruction came in, small and inscrutable as a folded note. Other teams shouted names. A mother pressed her palms to his hands like a prayer. Donald's fingers found the right places. He kept the rhythm of compressions until the child's breath returned. People sobbed. The mother called him a saint. He felt nothing. Nothing slid across his chest when the room exhaled. Nothing in him changed. He walked to the hospital parking lot and lit a cigarette. The smoke tasted like ash and abbreviations. The lot was cold. His breath turned to glass. He finished the cigarette without consuming it. The clock in his car read 3:17 a.m. He thought of the child's lungs and the mother's face, and something in him wondered, politely and without heat, whether there was any more feeling left to be spent. The heat at the base of his skull came without warning. It was not the ache of exhaustion, it was a pressure, a demand from nowhere. For a moment, he looked up and saw nothing but the hotel neon of nearby businesses. Then the lot changed. The air above the pavement shimmered as if heat were rising over coals. A soundless ripple, like a finger dragging along the skin of the world. He did not see a movie-style ship or the bright hypersonic things people imagine. He saw a presence that did not need to enter in any way we expect. It arranged itself in the margins of thought. He felt an idea land in him, as if memory and foreignness had become a single sentence. The voice came without vocal cords. It was clean and dry and precise, like a surgeon's scalpel. It did not use words the way humans use them. Instead, it gave images and then wrapped a phrase around them. "You are on a path of slow silence," it said. The tone carried neither malice nor warmth. It carried observation. Donald's first rational reflex was to check for hypoxia, to feel his pulse, to insist on a method. He found he could breathe. His hands were steady. The idea of this presence was what unsettled him. There was a mind communicating that did not obey the rules he had learned in life. He was, bluntly, alone in a world that had been too close for too long, and a thing from somewhere else had put its palm on his shoulder. "What are you?" he thought, because thinking felt safer than speaking. "Not what you expect," the presence replied. "I am an observer." The light around him pulsed, and with each pulse came a silhouette. Sweeping plains, long, slow dunes, and then kneeling figures drawing lines on a flat earth, and a view from above that showed geometric shapes forming like a language. The images pressed like photographs into his mind, until they became an underlying hum. Nazca. The name appeared as if in his mouth, not as a word he had learned, but as a memory he had forgotten he could remember. "We left markers," the observer said. "We left them until you were ready to read." The alien's voice, the narrator's inner voice called it the observer in Donald's memory, explained with the vocabulary of someone who had watched species grow and learned to wait. The geoglyphs were not, in this telling, monuments to gods. They were deliberate, large-scale signals placed on a planet in transit. Markers for an ecology that included potential observers. Organisms capable of a specific kind of relationship the observer's race cared about. The lines were both a test and a threshold. "We constructed a lattice to monitor emotional connectivity," the observer said. "We built it to be visible when a species reached necessary spatial and communicative thresholds. It was never meant to be a map of stone or a poem carved into clay. It was a ledger. It was a wake-up flag." The words landed like a hypothesis inside Donald's trained skepticism. Inside his skull, the training pulled names and counter-arguments into neat files. Anthropologists would laugh at the hubris of it. Archaeologists would call for evidence. But the presence did not bargain for proof. It offered images and a calendar of feeling. "You are in decline," it said. "Not physically, not yet. Emotionally. Empathy is eroding. It will not be visible in broken roofs or empty fields. It will be visible in a silence that replaces grief, in a world where people stop inclining their bodies toward one another in the way the living do when they are awake." When he asked how it knew, the response came as a series of small, sharp visions. A city where people stared slightly askew at blue glass instead of at each other. Classrooms where teachers spoke, but eyes stared at glowing screens. Hospital rooms where nurses documented care carefully while the patient slept without anyone's hand on their arm. He saw his own hands working like that in dozens of variants, performing the outward math of competence without the internal arithmetic of care. The observer did not talk like a prophet. It spoke like a diagnostician. "You are not doomed," it said. "You are at risk. We project, in our observation models, that if current dynamics continue, species like yours may cross a threshold in which the systems of connection begin to fail irreversibly." The word irreversibly felt heavy in his chest, because a physician knows what irreversible looks like. But the observer wrapped the claim not in statistics, but in pattern and possibility. When Donald asked for specifics, the imagery grew colder and more clinical. "In the observer's calculation," it said, "certain network effects become self-sustaining. The brief window for cultural reversal before emergent disconnection becomes the normal operating mode narrows. But these were the observer's metrics, offered as a cautionary fiction, thresholds, probabilities, contingent windows, not incontrovertible fact, not prophecy carved in stone." Donald felt the air sharpen. He asked, without wanting to, whether it had been watching long. The image of Nazca returned, like a ledger stamped across time. "We have watched festivals, births, wars, and treaties," the observer said. "We placed markers where the social lattice was easiest to observe from the sky. Those markers were designed to become legible when the imbalance they monitored reached particular ratios of disconnection to connection. In simpler words, and that parable landed with the weight of a child showing a pebble, the Nazca Lines were an alarm clock the size of a plateau. Someone big enough had set it out where it would be impossible to miss if you ever learned to look the right way. Now the alarm was ringing. If this sounds impossible, Donald thought, it would be impossible in all the practical ways he had been trained to insist on. He was, for a suspended second, ridiculous to himself and perfectly credulous. The experience felt like an error in his operating system. He might have been the only person with the right frequency to receive it. Still, the images lodged like grit under fingernails. The observer did not spend time persuading him. It showed. Montages folded, human infants reaching for faces, neighbors bringing bread to funerals, 1,000 hands lifting the fallen in 1,000 small economies of care. Then the montage shifted, hands sliding past one another as phones intervened, drivers honking and then looking back down at maps, a young teacher finishing a lecture with empty applause and a class that archived affection in likes. The tempo grew urgent. "We did not come to frighten you," the observer said. "We came to inform. We mapped. You ignored the map until you began to erase your own signals." The underneath of the argument was simple. The engine of your civilization can be functional without the living ember of communal feeling. A machine of people can keep running. But without certain relational feedbacks, the small acts that confirm other people's subjectivity, the social organism cools. It becomes durable and hollow. Donald had, by the time the lot's fluorescent lights began to pale, moved from skepticism to a kind of professional curiosity. He had been a physician long enough to understand patterns and to respect warnings. The observer was offering a diagnosis that included causes. That was its invitation. There were 5 of them, the observer said, concise as a surgical checklist: substitution, training, trauma, productivity, and fixation. Substitution. Technology had become a substitution for presence. Devices mimicked the shape of intimacy and were rewarded for convenience and speed more than for depth. The observer's mind showed him a montage of people swiping in bed while their partners slept beside them like strangers. The speed of signal had outrun the development of attention. Training. Professional cultures that prized diagnostic distance rewarded the suppression of feeling. Donald watched his own medical training as a formation ritual that smoothed rough edges of feeling, shaping steel in the name of surviving emergency rooms. This was adaptive. It was also a vector for numbness when left unchecked. Trauma. The observer displayed a timeline of unprocessed national traumas lodged like sediment, each wave compacting the layer beneath. Pandemics, wars, mass displacement. Events that left scars because societies did not set aside time to truly process them, to grieve and to tell one another what the losses meant. Productivity. Work cultures that valorize output above care made efficiency an identity. The more people equated value with productivity, the less space remained for messy, slow human repair. Fixation. A different threat, the fixation on external apocalypse, produced a paradox. When communities obsess over imagined ends, they outsource moral agency to future deliverance. They prepare for catastrophe while neglecting the day-by-day repairs of being a feeling community. The list did not excuse him. It made a map. Donald felt that map like a glove, and it fit. How do you fix that? He asked the lot in thought. That question was practical. He was a practical man by training. Cut, repair, stitch, return the patient to the ward. The observer's answer was short and procedural. One can reverse erosion by reinstating small acts, it said, by micro-decisions repeated, by choosing to engage again even when the engine wants the easier path. It offered him a scaffolding that night, not a miraculous cure, but an operational plan. 7 practices, the observer said. 7 choices that anyone could make that would, if repeated, recondition feeling. Donald's training kicked in. He cataloged them mentally, like interventions you might try in a clinic. Pause, connect, process, abstain, vulnerability, attend, gather. Each word was a door. The observer flagged the first 2 quickly, as if to anchor him in the real world. Pause, acknowledge. 10 seconds, not long. When a sudden emotion arises, anger, loss, fatigue, pause and name it. Naming concentrates an experience. It interrupts automatic reflexes that anesthetize. Connect. 1 face-to-face conversation a week with devices off. Not texting, not recorded and edited. A gaze, a breath, a place where presence is not traded for convenience. Donald heard the structure of the prescriptions and, as a physician, disliked their simplicity. He wanted data, scripts, a study. Instead, he had a call to action that felt both ancient and tiny. He imagined taking 10 seconds in the middle of an OR. He imagined asking his daughter to sit with him with both phones off. He imagined 100 small disobediences to the pace his life had demanded. The observer did not promise that these measures would erase everything. It never promised miracles. It placed probability where certainty could not exist. In its models, it said, if enough of a community repeated these behaviors reliably, a cascade reversal was possible. If it sounded like politics, it was. The mechanics of culture are statistical at scale, pocketed by human choice at ground level. Donald felt the weight of the responsibility. He was exhausted. He was also culpable. The image of the child's mother gripping his hands at the hospital came back, and he realized with a small jolt that he had been the one who had learned to remove the heat from another person's story for the sake of functioning. He had been trained to trade feeling for output. In meeting that compromise with his own life, he had, the observer implied, become part of the erosion. The voice softened, if minds can be said to soften. We did not come to shame, it said. We came as a mirror. We left you the lines so someone could one day read this ledger and be alerted. The marker's purpose is not to impose, but to remind. Donald tried to compose himself. He said the logical things in his head. Follow up, report, find evidence. He understood the world as a series of verifiable events. The presence anticipated this. It offered a way he could test the claim without wholesale belief. Carmen, a nurse the observer showed him in a flash, went through her rounds with efficiency and no pause at the bedside. She recorded what needed recording and left. No one asked her if she had found meaning today. Donald felt the future like a frost on exposed skin. The scene was quietly terrifying because it was not spectacular. There were no ruins or crashed satellites. The horror was small. Families who ate together in silence with 2 devices placed like sentries on the table. Children who became proficient in empathy tests, but who never, in the way the observer dramatized, caught another child's tears and stayed. You will not necessarily notice a slow silence, the observer said. It feels like suboptimal convenience until it becomes the norm. Then you will be living in the after-image of a species that has lost its way. The image of Nazca returned then. Lines like instruction manuals, visible only from above. The observer's voice indicated that the geoglyphs were designed to become legible to a species when it reached a particular stage of technological and social development. The message was not a history lesson. It was a hand on the shoulder. Wake up now, or the change will be harder. Donald did not take the vision as a commandment. He took it as a problem statement. He had been a physician to bodies. Now he was being asked to act as a first responder to a society's interior life. That was not a role he had chosen when he signed up for residency. It was a role that arrived anyway. The observer spoke of leverage points. Influence matters, it said. Teachers shape young minds. Doctors shape how people understand suffering. Leaders create the environments that reward connection or disconnection. You who have a place in others' lives, tend them well. Do not underestimate the spread of small, intentional practices. When Donald pressed the presence on strategy, it enumerated with surgical economy. Start with the small circles. Family, ward, classroom, then expand. Model, teach, repeat. The math in the observer's models was not miraculous. It was contagion sensitive. A critical minority could tip systems back toward repair. There was always a catch. The observer's calculations were not guarantees. They were conditional. They were a forecast about probabilities dependent on choices made at scale. They belonged in the hypothetical. They were the kind of thing you might tell someone to induce action without claiming divinity. You could ignore them. You could test them. Donald thought of his colleagues, the strict clinicians who scoffed at soft things. He thought of attending physicians who taught detachment like doctrine. He thought of the hospital board, worried about readmission rates and quarterly metrics. If a small cadre of practitioners, doctors, nurses, social workers, quietly practiced presence, could that shift culture? The observer suggested so. That suggestion landed like an assignment. He tried the first practice in the waiting room the next day while a family held the hand of an old woman who would not speak. He paused. He named the feeling that rose in his throat: sorrow, exhaustion, a small well of grief for the way the woman's memory was knitting itself into silence. He did not exponentiate it into a narrative. He felt it, as the instruction asked him to, for 10 seconds, then reached for the old woman's hand and let the gesture be itself. Not talk, not solution, not data, just warmth. The woman's fingers twitched. The granddaughter, who had been staring at her phone, folded it closed. No miracle followed, but someone in the room shifted their posture. It was small. It was enough to be the kind of thing that might, when repeated elsewhere, add up to something else. At home, he kept a notebook. He wrote the word Nazca on the top line, underlined it, and then let the rest of the page, for the first time in years, become a place to put down feelings. He wrote about the ambulance lights, about the child's mother, about the cigarette in the parking lot, and the voice that had told him to look up. He scrawled the first 2 practices the observer had offered, and then hesitated to write the others, believing that structure helps memory. The presence returned that night as he folded the page. You must tell someone, the observer said. Not to create a panic, not to claim a miracle, but to model a different kind of conversation. Start small. Name the experiences. Invite the small practice. Donald realized the work would be quieter than he had imagined, more domestic than heroic. It would involve confessing, in fits and starts, to his ex-wife that he had been numb and was trying to change. It would involve telling his daughter that he wanted to be present in ways he had not been. It would involve being mocked by colleagues whose defense was irony. It would involve relapsing and starting again. He was scared, though he did not speak the word. Fear sits like a ledger in physicians. Fear that you will fail your duty. Fear that you will be judged as weak. Fear that the effort will be pointless. The observer recognized fear as a predictable variable. Fear is not a reason to stop, it said. It is a reason to begin with small, repeatable steps. For all its clarity, the observer also contained a form of tenderness. In its long experience, it had learned that some species change from the edges inward. It had walked away from planets where the biology of society hardened into an efficient shell. It did not like to record extinction. Therefore, they had left lacework, Nazca, as an emergency signal, a way to say, in a scale you must literally climb to see, pay attention now. Donald, for reasons he could not entirely explain, accepted the premise enough to test it. He did not tell his department head. He did not place the incident on a productivity report. He kept a small, private experiment. 1 10-second pause once per shift. 1 device-free conversation per week with Sarah. He tried to make the gaps of practice regular, like taking vitamins. The work was grimly human. Once, after an impossible night, he paused and named, out loud in an empty locker room, the thing that had hollowed him: exhaustion, empathy fatigue, and the quiet guilt of thinking of his ex-wife's face when she'd asked whether he still loved their shared home. Saying it out loud made something move. The muscles around his eyes, unused by the currency of efficiency, remembered how to ache. But story is not composed purely of the small acts of repair. The observer's vision thread wove back in, like a needle re-entering cloth, pointing to both a prolonged systemic hazard and to a moment of decision. It showed that if the momentum continued toward erasure, the coming decades would carry a lot of intact infrastructure and little warmth. It told him that the Nazca map was not a prophecy in granite. It was an option to take seriously. Donald felt the gravity of that. He also felt resistant, because human culture seldom allows one man to bend the arc alone. Still, the role of influence mattered. He could be a node. If a node practices presence, perhaps the local net would rewire. Perhaps an ER nurse who learned a 15-second pause might start the ripple. Perhaps a teacher who made 1 hour of weekly device-free conversation the rule of the class would train a small cohort of children in attention. He enumerated possible allies. The chaplain who had read the same line of scripture in 1,000 rooms and never seemed to tire of the ache of human failure. The residency director who liked him enough to listen. A handful of young interns who were still flexible. He made a list in his phone. Sarah, milk. Chaplain, ask about small group. Interns, lunch. Each item felt like a stitch. The observer leaned on the image of the plateau again, large lines meant to be read from afar. If only a handful of people shift, it looks like nothing on the chart. If enough do, the markup tilts. You will fail sometimes, the observer said. The reversal is not guaranteed. You may tire, you may be mocked. But if you do nothing, the decline is nearly certain in the observer's models. The choice is therefore not between universal certainty and failure. It is between a probable slide and a possible reversal that requires action. Donald looked at the notebook where he had written Nazca at the top. The letters were smudged from his thumb. He read them as if they were instructions. The opening act, a geoglyph activating a watchman to show a weary physician a possible catastrophic path, had unfolded. The rest of the work, he realized, would be mundane and stubborn. It would require him to press his hand into the small and repeated decisions of daily life. He did not know if the observer was a solitary presence or a scout for a more elaborate intelligence. He did not know what other markers lay around the world. The Nazca Lines were only the beginning of the story as far as the presence had shown. What he did know was the shame and, oddly, the relief of starting to feel again. When he drove past the highway billboard that evening, an image of the geoglyphs flashed on his phone as an article he'd meant to read reached the top of his offline pile. The headline on his screen was cautious. New decoding suggests mysterious geoglyphs may have been symbolic. Caution is the natural posture of headlines. The observer had told him not to weaponize Nazca. The lines were a narrative device, not an archaeological assertion. Still, he felt the gravity of the image on his chest. The work of change is not theatrical. It will be small, the observer said. It will be stubborn, monotonous, and unromantic. You will not be celebrated for it, but you will feel your life change. Donald turned the phone off. He did not do it as a loud gesture. He did it like a man who had learned a small discipline. He simply flipped the device face down and closed the lid on the small rectangle of light. He told Sarah, "No phones for dinner tonight," and watched the muscle of surprise form in her jaw. She asked why. He said, "Because I want to hear you." It was not eloquent. It was enough. Later that night, As he lay awake with the outline of his city leaking into the darkness, he thought about how many small choices he had made in the name of efficiency. He thought about the families he had walked past with bruised-sounding silences instead of outbursts. He thought about the dry applause when a colleague announced a success, and how little conversation there had been about the cost of that success. The observer returned briefly with another image, Nazca Lines visible, for a moment, as a set of instructions for reconnection. The phrase that threaded the image into his memory was simple and oddly kind. "We will not press the button for you," it said. "We put the alarm where you might hear it. The rest is yours." Donald closed his eyes and, for the first time in years, tried to rest without inventing a solution for the next day. He felt fatigue as an honest thing, not an enemy to be medicated away. He did not expect miracles. He expected repetition. Morning came. The hospital came back to life with the efficiency of a clock. He paused once at triage, named the thing in him, and then chose to stay in that pause for 11 seconds. It was a small rebellion against the mechanized posture he had habitually called professionalism. The pulse of the world did not seem to change. But when he looked up, the intern across from him had paused too, just long enough to meet the eye of the patient and offer a warm hand. That single, small mirror of presence felt, for a breath, like a reason to try. And as afternoon waned, the dent in his life widened into a question the size of a plateau. If one man can change the tenor of a hospital corridor, what happens when thousands, then millions, simply choose to be slightly more present? Would the Nazca Lines, those vast carved instructions, have meant anything at all? Or would they be another relic, unread and misunderstood? The lot where the observer had first spoken felt emptier now, less like a locus of contact and more like the place where a man had decided to start. He did not know, that night, how to turn the idea into a program, a policy, a movement. He only knew that he had started. He had not yet embraced all 7 practices. He had tried the first 2 and floundered, and tried again. He had not yet seen whether his efforts would ripple. The observer's future warning still vibrated, like a low alarm, promising either thaw or freeze. The decision to act had been made. The consequences remained to be written. Somewhere, on a high plateau, the Nazca drawings waited like an enormous question mark. They had been placed there by a visitor with a long patience and an odd sense of humor. Carve something visible from the sky and hope the animals below learn to read their own habits. Donald went home that night to a house that smelled of reheated food and the small, stubborn life of a 12-year-old. He carried the sort of tired hope that feels unreliable at first. He placed his notebook on the kitchen table beside the milk carton and the folded soccer schedule. He watched Sarah draw lines on a piece of paper, copying a bird she had seen in a museum book. "Do you ever think something you do can change a lot of things?" she asked him without looking up. He thought of geoglyphs and peppermints, of pause and presence. He answered as honestly as he could. "Sometimes," he said, "sometimes a little change at the right time can be a very big thing." She smiled and handed him the paper. The bird looked like a child's drawing, raw and accurate and brave. Outside, above the horizon, the sky was big enough to hold a plateau and doubts. The story was moving, like a river that has started to cut a new channel. It would take time. It would require repetition. It would require allies who did not exist yet. There would also be other things, the observer had said in one clipped transmission, that felt less like instruction and more like a cautionary fragment. Be aware of the conveyor belts of convenience. Be wary of institutional rituals that reward distance. Intervene where you can. Teach what you learn. Donald put the bird drawing on the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a heart he had kept from his daughter's toddler years. He did not fully believe he could stop a global slide. He believed he could try, and that belief would be the experiment he ran. He closed his eyes and, in the dark, thought of Nazca Lines as both alarm and manual, waiting for people who had been asleep to wake and decide, finally, to rehearse small, stubborn acts of being fully human. The next morning would bring another shift, another test. He would meet a nurse who had been reduced to checklists. He would face an attending who laughed at soft interventions. He would have to choose again. When he opened the door, his phone vibrated with a low-priority alert, new research on social connectivity, a curious nod to the idea he'd been containing. He turned the phone over and walked toward the parking lot where, months before, a silent signal had met him under the stars. The lines on the plateau may have been carved long ago, but the moment to read them had arrived in the private choices he would, from now on, be forced to make. The next weeks shaped themselves around small resistances. Donald made it chart in the back of his notebook, 7 rows, empty boxes to tick, because habits, he knew, respond to scaffolding. He wrote the observer's words at the top, micro decisions, not miracles. Then he began, imperfectly. The 7 practices took on flesh in his routine. Pause. Name. 10 seconds. Donald placed the idea at the front of his mind like a talisman. In triage, when a family arrived with a man who'd fallen from a ladder, he felt the familiar spike of sterile efficiency. Do this, do that, move the system. He caught himself, exhaled, and spent 10 seconds labeling what rose: impatience, dread, fatigue. Saying it to himself reduced its authority. The label thinned the panic. He reached for a plastic cup of water, handed it to the man's wife, and let silence do more than his checklist could. Connect. 1 device-free conversation per week. He cleared a weeknight on his calendar and told Sarah he would be present from 6 to 7. No phone, no pages if it could be avoided. She laughed at the proposal as if it were a novelty. They played a card game badly, and she told a story about a boy at school who had bullied a classmate. Donald listened, really listened, and when he asked her what she thought the boy needed, she looked at him like he had asked the map to speak. The conversation bent something in both of them back toward one another. Process. Write, speak, choose a witness. Donald began to keep short entries, 3 sentences about a case, 1 line about how it made him feel. He told the chaplain he trusted, Father Miguel, that he had been numb and wanted a place to make meaning again. Father Miguel did not preach. He listened, and then suggested Donald start a small group among the interns to process night shift vignettes once a month. It wasn't therapy in a clinical sense, it was a ritual of witness. Abstain. 24 hours without screens once a week. Donald selected a Saturday and shut his phone in a drawer. The first tech fast felt like withdrawing a limb. He noticed the absence of constant news and the relief of his attention on spooling. He made a pot of coffee and sat in the living room with Sarah, who brought out a puzzle. They fit down pieces together. At night, he slept deeper, not because an app told him to, but because his head had less static. Vulnerability. 1 small confession a day. Not grand, not theatrical, just a sentence. I'm tired today. I feel worried. He practiced with colleagues in harmless ways. A short admission over a coffee break that this morning's code had left him rattled. In response, a resident offered a hand across the table. Vulnerability, practiced in tiny doses, started to be redefined in his social environment as trust rather than weakness. Attend. A ritual before work. 3 counted breaths, a blade of intention to see each patient as a person. He would stand for 30 seconds before his shift and think of a name he'd met the week before, remembering a detail that made that person human. Mrs. Kent's old scarf, the child's small chalk drawing. It shifted the lens through which he moved. People were no longer composite charts, but stories he had the privilege to enter. Gather. Find or make community. Donald convened the chaplain, a young residency director named Dr. Patel, who had once encouraged social learning, and 2 sympathetic senior nurses. He suggested a pilot meeting, 15 minutes every Tuesday, to share a brief human story from the ward. They were skeptical but curious. The first meeting was awkward and almost comic, a room of professionals unused to showing tenderness. But it became a place where a resident admitted sleeplessness and a nurse spoke about a mother who had held her sick son's hand for 12 hours. The words landed. The next week, someone brought coffee. Each practice was small and concrete. They did not promise sudden salvation. They were exercises. Donald failed more often than he succeeded. He would pause and then check messages. He would plan a device-free dinner and then answer a single critical text. He would try a confession and, hearing his own voice tremble, retreat into a joke. But the rules required only repetition, not perfection. The observer had said as much. A community does not rewire by perfection, but by enough small deviations from the default. At the hospital, the changes were subtle but visible. In the break room, an intern mentioned the Tuesday meeting to an attending who had scoffed at soft stuff for years. The attending grunted, but asked, out of habit perhaps, how the sessions were run. That question, smallness itself, invited the culture to notice. Nurses began to mark a 10-second pause on the whiteboard as a legitimate step in preload preparation for patients with complicated needs. No administrative memo insisted. It happened by practice and then imitation. A quiet contagion began. The observer's transmissions came less frequently now. Sometimes a brief, cool visitation in the early hours of the morning. Sometimes a single visual like a frameless photograph. When it spoke, its voice remained clinical, unfussy, a mind doing triage for a species. Small networks matter, it said. The voice's short lines read like directives and then retreated into the shape of a scientist who had learned to feel tenderness anyway. If 15% of nodes change behavior, models show a shift in contagion dynamics, it said. The number landed as the kind of thing Donald treated in his head like a thought experiment, an if tied to a conditional tense. The observer's calculus felt like gravity and not a prophecy. If the community reached that threshold, then the statistical tendencies would bend away from the decline. The figure was not evidence, it was incentive. People began to notice the small things. A family, previously staccato with grief, found a nurse who would sit quietly at the bedside for 5 minutes when machines sounded. A teacher, a sister of a resident, implemented a rule in her literature class, 1 hour a week of device-free discourse. She told her students a story about a plateau and a man who paused, a story that was fictional in one sense and true in another. The teacher's class, in turn, produced a project of letters students wrote to parents without screens. Those letters traveled home and were read aloud at kitchen tables. Yet, the observer's visions of the future returned with inexorable clarity, not to frighten Donald, but to make choices vivid. One transmission took him into a city where every building was well kept, every delivery prompt and complete, and people who had known each other their whole lives now lived like polite ghosts. Children could pass standardized empathy tests and still fail to notice the hollow in an elder's meal. The imagery was precise and clinical. It did not need loud scares. That was the horror. You will not see fires or ruin, the observer said. You will see more efficient mourning and fewer ceremonies. You will hear fewer stories about the dead because no one reads the room long enough to tell them. Donald's progress was neither linear nor comfortable. Months in, after a crushing night when a bus accident filled the ER with wounded bodies and waiting families, he fell back into a numbness he thought he had stitched shut. He found himself in his car, hands shaking, the chaplain's number in his pocket, but not dialing. He lit another cigarette, the old friend of professional distance. The old engine clicked back on, and he spent the drive home answering clinical messages and not noticing the sunset. The shame of relapse hurt differently than the original numbness. It felt like a wound reopened by his own hand. He sat in the kitchen in the dark with Sarah asleep down the hall and finally texted Father Miguel. The chaplain answered with a single line, "Begin again." There was no condemnation. There was a short sermon in presence, Do not let perfection be the enemy of a flattened attempt. Donald stood up and walked to Sarah's room and did not try to fix things with a tidy phrase. He told her he needed help. That small admission, tender and immediate, yielded something he had not been able to perform: the feeling of kinship in frailty. Sarah, 12 and stubborn, rolled her eyes but also passed him a mug of cold cocoa. The exchange, a micro-ritual of mutual care, mended his night. Word of micro-practice spread not as a movement but as scattered experiments. A social worker began a noon group at a shelter that encouraged people to tell one true sentence about their day. A teacher used pause and name as an angle in classroom management. These were not sweeping policies. They were acts of stubbornness against a culture that rewarded output. The observer's interventions grew more pointed. In one visit, its mind drew a map of leverage points: hospitals, schools, local media, religious leaders, and managers of technology firms who could choose to design for attention rather than for endless stimulation. It did not moralize, it simply identified nodes in a network. Teachers, it said, doctors, community organizers. Where attention is formed, it can be shaped. Donald listened and, with a clinician's instinct for scaling interventions, tried to think strategically. He began to speak at morning briefings about the value of a 15-second pause before procedures. He asked his residency director for 10 minutes at grand rounds to present the small pilot of weekly gatherings. He did not cloak the idea in untestable rhetoric. He showed simple before and after notes. Interns said they felt less exhausted. Nurses reported fewer mistakes caused by numbness. The data were subjective and small, but they were persuasive because they were tangible. Resistance remained. Some attendings ridiculed the practices as sentimental. A hospital board member raised an eyebrow in a budget meeting and asked what the metrics were. Donald did not promise to heal the hospital with a few meetings. He offered an experiment the board could watch and evaluate: a 3-month pilot, a small team, qualitative feedback. It was modest enough to win approval. Meanwhile, Sarah began to test her father's new practices. In adolescence, sincerity can be merciless, but she took to the device-free dinners like a scientist testing a hypothesis. She noticed him listening differently. She began to ask more probing questions, and sometimes she received answers. One night she came to him after a band rehearsal and asked about the time he had almost left medicine. He told a truncated truth. The conversation landed like a pebble that made more ripples than either expected. The observer's voice, when it came, was as precise as ever. Time frames are variable, it told him. In some histories, individuals tip in 3 to 5 years. In other models, socio-cultural shifts take longer. We calculate risk across ranges. Donald repeated the numbers to himself in private so the figures would not become oracles. These were the observer's models, not scripture. But the idea of individual windows, short enough for a single person to be decisive in their lifespan, gave him courage. He thought of his own practice as a time-limited experiment, not a life sentence. If he could help recondition himself in 2 to 3 years, maybe he could also affect a field of people who would then seed further change. The most dramatic moment of influence came quietly. A young nurse named Carmen returned to work after a bereavement leave and found Donald in the waiting area, hands ungloved, just sitting with a family. She later described to a colleague the thing she felt watching him: someone putting the tiny weight of presence over pain. Carmen began to practice the 10-second pause at the start of each shift. She told the story to an online forum for emergency nurses, careful in her language, avoiding hype. Her post was personal and specific. It described a ritual: 3 breaths, a name, a hand held. It was not a program, it was a testimony. The post circulated quietly, generating other posts. No one promised a cure. People shared small practices and said, "This helped me stay." From the observer's point of view, those posts were the sort of seed that, when sown enough places, could change soil chemistry. From the human point of view, they were comradely confessions. The future vision returned in force one dusty afternoon. Donald was tired, a low ache behind his eyes, when the transmission came. A montage of 2040 cities, efficient and empty in the ways that mattered. He saw schoolyards where children played algorithmically correct games but did not lift one another when they fell. Art museums had plenty of visitors, no one lingered to interpret the brushstroke of sorrow in a painting. Hospitals ran cleaner lines on indicators but had fewer people standing at bedsides. The photograph was not spectacular. It was a perfect, banal absence. "You will have machines that remember better than people," the observer said. "You will have structures that perform empathy, but they will perform it the way a well-programmed assistant does, with correctness but without surprise. Surprise is a pathway to connection. You will lose that." Donald absorbed the image like a clinician absorbing an image of a heart with a slowly closing valve. The picture clarified the stakes. He went to the residency director and asked to expand the pilot. 15 minutes of weekly case processing for the whole cohort, with optional participation for nurses. Dr. Patel agreed to try, if Donald would help design the sessions. It was a small expansion, conditioned by budgets and schedules, and yet the fact that senior staff had accepted the proposal felt significant. Not everyone bought in. There were accusations of sentimentality in staff meetings. There were jokes about namaste medicine that cut through the pilot's seriousness. Donald tolerated the barbs and persisted. During an afternoon when the ER brimmed with the tired and the angry, a resident who had attended a single processing session sat with a terrified family and did not attempt to explain away the fear. She met the family's gaze and offered a short, honest sentence. "I don't know how this will go. I'm here with you." The family's shoulders finally eased. The resident later told Donald that she had learned to say that short sentence in the group and that it had saved her from using empty reassurances. Small sentences, tiny pauses, quiet rituals. They added up in ways that were at once modest and irreducible. Months became a year. The pilot continued. The observer's projections were always available as a caveat in our models. But Donald stopped treating them as prophecy and began to treat them as orientation, a map that could be used. He watched, not entirely without pride, as a small cluster of practitioners adopted the 7 practices, as teachers tried device-free conversations in classrooms, as a social worker began a neighborhood circle where people brought one true thing about their week. None of it was tidy, none of it was guaranteed. It was, however, alive. Then the call came that turned small seed into a public question. A local reporter writing a long piece about micro-practices to fight burnout interviewed Carmen and, cautiously, one of the nurses who had been in Donald's Tuesday sessions. The story framed their efforts as practical experiments rather than miracles. It had quotations, sober, modest lines about 10-second pauses and device-free dinners. The piece ran with a photograph of the hospital corridor. Internet commentators did what they always do. Some mocked, some praised, some asked for evidence. But one thing happened that Donald had not expected. A parent of a child treated in the ER, impressed by the way a clinician had named a feeling and sat quietly with them, wrote a note to the hospital praising the staff's humanity. The hospital saved the note in a folder. It was not a policy change. It was a story that made a small place hum with pride. The Observer sent one final transmission during that month, short and not unkind. "You have made a readable change," it said. "Continue. Influence is not force." The word readable mattered. The Nazca Lines had been made to be read from above. Humanity's work was to make its practices legible to one another, so that other people could see how to do it and then do it themselves. As the pilot matured, Donald received an invitation he had not sought, to travel to the Nazca Plateau. An academic who had read a murmur of the Observer story and the online nurse posts reached out with a cautious, scholarly curiosity. She was careful in her invitation. This would be a trip not to prove anything, but to understand why a story like this landed so hard in human imagination. Donald accepted with the awkward humility of someone who had never wanted to be a symbol. He went to Nazca with a small group: the academic, Carmen, Father Miguel, and Sarah, who had insisted on coming despite school. They traveled not in pursuit of facts, but to stand on a vast ledge and look. The plateau was larger than the pictures. From the ground, the geoglyphs were earth and weather. The patterns were not an easily legible manual unless you climbed into the air. Standing at the edge, Donald thought of the observer's voice and the words etched into his notebook. He felt small under the sky, like an animal whose habits had been watched and catalogued by someone patient and very, very old. They did not find proof. There were no framed telegraphs or alien artifacts. Instead, in the thin air, with the wind pressing sand against their boots, the group read the narrative as a metaphor made real, a plateau that looked like someone's ledger when you climbed above it. The academic, cautious as a scientist, said the right things about evidence and speculation. Carmen said little, as if the scale itself had quieted her. The observer's voice arrived for Donald then, not as an argument, but as a final, condensed imperative. "We left you a ledger," it said. "We left you prompts. We did what patience allows. We do not claim ownership of any outcome." Donald thought of the thousands of small acts across months and a handful of public sentences. He thought of failures and resume-like victories that were only meaningful when they penetrated the world of other people's practices. He thought of Sarah's laugh and the way she had turned a device-free dinner into a weekly ritual for her friends. The plateau underfoot became an emblem. The geoglyphs were not a factual testimony in the way an archaeological paper is. In their new story, they were a narrative device, a visible, ancient shape meant to arrest attention when a species had become capable of seeing its own decline in the round. "We cannot tell you what your future will be," the observer said. "We can show you what it would look like if you choose not to act. We can offer prompts, and we can watch." Donald felt the weight of the ending and the relief that came with being asked to be an agent rather than a subject. The secret of Nazca, if the word secret did not make the phenomenon grander than it should be, was not a piece of technology, but a form of pedagogy writ in land. It was a wake-up call that assumed a species could learn. It assumed a species had hands and could practice new tasks. On the plateau, Sarah traced the outline of a condor with her finger in the sand. She asked, innocently and with the practical curiosity of the young, whether the lines were like homework. Donald laughed and said yes and no. The homework was to notice and to change. The group left Nazca without fanfare. They took photographs and notes. The academic planned a careful piece that would frame the trip as cultural reception of a story, not as evidence of out-of-world contact. Donald returned to his hospital and his notebook and the small sessions and the Tuesdays and the chaplain's quiet counsel. The months turned into something like a practicable life. Donald kept failing. He also kept returning. The interns who had once rolled their eyes now occasionally paused in a hallway and named a feeling. A teacher in town sent him a note about a student who wrote a letter to an elderly neighbor. The neighbor had smiled when someone sat and read it aloud. The scale of change could still be counted, for now, in single acts. But single acts had a way of aggregating into something else. The observer's model, its out-there numbers and its hypothetical 15% threshold, remained what it always had been, a conditional map. But Donald found that the moral of the story was less about hitting a number and more about resonance. Presence was contagious if people could see it done and find it worth imitating. If the Nazca Lines were a wake-up call, the way to answer was not to look for external saviors, but to rehearse a human skill: attention. 1 year after the first parking lot contact, Donald stood in an auditorium at his hospital for the closing of the pilot. The room smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant. He could feel the weight of eyes. He did not stand to preach. He stood to report. He spoke of a small project. A dozen clinicians had convened weekly. They had written brief notes, and a dozen more had tried a device-free dinner with a friend. He read 2 entries, one from a nurse who had held a teenager's hand, and another from a resident who had said, "I do not know," and found that the patient had used the space to speak their fear. The pilot's metrics were modest, the director admitted. Fewer self-reported burnout indicators in the small sample, modest increases in staff satisfaction, and a handful of qualitative comments from families. The board would decide about scaling. The room was not wrapped. The pilot was not a revolution. It was a demonstration, earnest and fragile. After the meeting, a woman lingered. She had been a patient in the ER months before and had written that note praising the staff. She told Donald that the simple act of someone staying in the room had reminded her that she mattered. She said she had been surprised by how much that moment had shifted the shape of her grief. Donald felt something like undeserved grace. The observer's last long transmission to him came one night after that meeting. There was no telegraph of numbers, no cold calculation. There was an image of the plateau seen now as a possibility rather than a ledger that had been checked off. "You have been taught to do small things," it said. "Teach them to others. Make them visible. Repeat." The message, short and precise, was the same teaching Donald had been living for months. He understood now that the Nazca Lines, if one understood them as a fictional frame, were a pedagogy for a species that had developed technology to watch itself and perhaps, finally, to notice what it was doing to its interior life. He thought of the broader systems the observer had named: training schools that reward distance, productivity cultures that reduce people to tasks, trauma unprocessed across generations. He could not fix all of it, but he could be a node, not a savior. The model told him that nodes matter. That year, neither the world nor the plateau changed overnight, but Donald had been given something profound: the humility of partial agency. He had learned to regard heroic answers as improbable in scale, and daily practices as plausible. He had relearned how to weep, not spectacularly, but as adjustment, and how to sit with a mother without saying anything. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, he sat with Sarah under a familiar tree and read her a short paragraph about the plateau, not as corroboration, but as story. She asked thoughtfully whether people in the future would laugh at the idea that such lines could do anything. He said, maybe. Sarah, practical as any modern child, asked whether it mattered if people laughed or not. "It matters," he said. "If you learn to notice, you can change. If you don't, someone else might have to do the noticing for you." She considered this, and then, with the brisk logic of a 12-year-old, suggested they write one line to a neighbor each week for a month. He agreed. The practice was small and contained. It could be repeated. The final months of the narrative did not tidy every fracture. Donald and his ex-wife argued awkwardly about past neglect. They made slow progress in reconfiguring co-parenting. He found himself tired and impatient some mornings. He still had nights when he smoked. He still sometimes scrolled in the middle of a pause. But there were more and more small things to balance the failures. An intern who reported that she could sleep better. A teacher who told him a child had asked a grandparent to share a memory. A nurse who saved 5 minutes at a bedside to sit with a patient's family. None of these actions claimed to reverse history. They were, however, acts that resisted the quiet freeze the observer had described. In the last transmission Donald received before he made public what he had been doing, the observer offered one last gentle caution. "We will not be your evidence," it said. "We are a lens you asked to be given. Decide what you will do with the view." Donald returned the lens into practice. He wrote a short guide, not a cure, not a manifesto, just a compact booklet of practices, the 7 choices, how to try them, how to fail and continue. He offered it as a tool, optional and practical. He did not promise reversal. He did not claim to reveal archaeological truths. He called it what it was: a set of small rituals that could be rehearsed until they felt like muscle memory. The final scene folded back to the plateau in idea more than in place. The Nazca Lines, which had started the whole thing as a speculation in a parking lot, had become an emblem for a species at a choice point. They were not revealed in a scientific sense. They had been used as an extraordinary story device to arrest attention and to map out a moral experiment. The secret the alien had offered was not a technology or a mystery solved. It was an invitation to notice, to practice, to teach. Donald kept doing the work. He kept failing and starting again. He taught interns how to pause. He sat at the bedside without speaking sometimes, and that silence became a place of permission for others to speak. He modeled vulnerability, and sometimes he was mocked. He persisted because the alternative, accepting a society that had perfected systems while losing its capacity to lament, seemed, by his training, a problem to address with repeated interventions. If you imagine a conclusion, it is not a tidy ending. It is a choice continued, a dozen modest rituals repeated across households, wards, classrooms. It is Sarah leaving a note for a neighbor, and the neighbor showing the child a memory. It is a nurse holding a hand for an extra minute, and a resident learning to say, "I don't know." It is a plateau someone looks at from above and sees lines that, once in a while, make sense only if the species below decides to read them. The Nazca Lines' secret, as told in this story, was never about definitive archaeological truth. It was about attention. If the observer's ledger was an allegory, then its lesson was a practical one. Training attention is training humanity. If you feel the urgency in this tale, know it's meant to be practical, not prophetic certitude. If one thing can be tried in your life today, pause. Name what rises. Take a single device-free hour with someone. Write one honest line about a hard case. These are practices, not promises. They are ways to rehearse being present. If you'd like a concise guide to the 7 practices, something you can print and try, there is an optional companion booklet available in the pinned link. It is a practical tool, offered without guarantees, to help you begin. Choose one small act today. See what happens.